Hey there, viewers. Here's a question for you. Have you ever been asked to do something at work that just didn't feel right? Drop your experience in the comments. Today's story comes from someone who was Diddy's personal chef on his 50th birthday, and what they were forced to cook that night still haunts them to this day. Let's get into it. Chapter 1: The Golden Invitation. I never thought much about the people I cooked for, not in the way you'd think. Yeah, I knew their names, their status, their preferences, how they liked their steak done, whether they had allergies, what their favorite comfort food was after a long night of partying. But to me, clients were clients. They'd eat what I made, pay what they owed, and I'd move on to the next gig. No attachments, no curiosity, just food. That's how it had always been. Until I got the invitation. It arrived on a crisp black envelope, the edges lined in gold. My name wasn't printed on it. It was written, carefully, in a handwriting so precise it almost looked printed. Inside, a single card with embossed gold lettering. The words were simple, direct. Your presence is requested as executive chef for a private event on the night of December 14th. Your services will be compensated generously. No sender's name, no further details, just an address, a time, and a phone number. The moment I ran my fingers over the cardstock, I knew. This wasn't just some high-end dinner. This was something different. I checked the address, and my stomach tightened. It was for Diddy's 50th birthday, the one everyone had been talking about, the one that had already been making headlines before it even happened. I hesitated. I'd worked for celebrities before, movie stars, athletes, even a couple of politicians, but this was different. Diddy didn't just throw parties, he curated them. They weren't just events, they were statements, myths in the making. The money, though, that was something else entirely. The number on the contract was more than I'd make in 6 months working private gigs, more than I could turn down. I called the number. A man answered, his voice smooth, professional, too polite. "We'll send a car for you at 6. And that was that. The car that picked me up wasn't a limo or some flashy sports car like I expected. It was a black SUV, windows tinted so dark I couldn't see a thing outside. The driver didn't speak, just nodded when I got in and pulled away from my apartment like we were heading somewhere off the map. The city blurred past, lights fading the further we went. I checked my phone, but there was no service. I asked the driver how far the venue was. He didn't answer. It wasn't until nearly an hour later that we pulled up to the mansion. I'd seen pictures of Diddy's homes before, but this one wasn't familiar. It wasn't the Beverly Hills estate, or the one in Miami, or even the one he'd thrown his past white parties at. This was different. More secluded. The entrance was lined with torches instead of spotlights. The gate was open, but no paparazzi were outside. No press. Just a long, winding driveway leading up to a mansion draped in gold and black. I stepped out of the SUV, smoothing my chef's coat. The moment my foot hit the ground, I felt it. Something was off. The air was too still, the kind of stillness you only notice when you're listening for it. The kind that makes the back of your neck prickle. Staff moved in quiet efficiency, their uniforms crisp, faces unreadable. No one greeted me. They just pointed me toward the back entrance where the kitchen staff was already preparing for the night. Inside, the mansion was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Opulence wasn't the right word, it was ritualistic. Black drapes covered the walls, embroidered with golden patterns that didn't quite make sense if you stared at them too long. The chandeliers were dim, casting shadows that stretched long across the marble floors. And the floors? The floors had symbols carved into them. At first, I thought it was just some elaborate design choice, the way luxury homes sometimes had custom tile work. But when I walked over them, I felt something strange beneath my shoes, like the grooves had been worn in by more than just time. I swallowed hard and kept moving. The kitchen was massive, easily 3 times the size of any I'd worked in before. Stainless steel counters gleamed under the soft overhead lights, rows of sous chefs already chopping, searing, preparing for the evening. The menu had been planned in advance, but I hadn't seen it yet. A clipboard was shoved into my hands the moment I walked in. "You're the head chef for the main courses," a woman said briskly. "Follow the schedule, keep your head down, and don't ask questions." I frowned at that last part, but didn't push. I'd been in high-pressure kitchens before. Sometimes you just did what you were told. Still, something in her voice didn't sit right with me. I scanned the menu. Most of it was expected. High-end dishes, the kind of extravagant meals you'd serve at an event like this. Wagyu, caviar, truffle-infused sauces, but some dishes stood out, not because of the ingredients but because of the instructions. One read, "Must be prepared only after midnight." Another, "Do not taste test." A third, "Served only on the black plates." I looked up, about to ask someone what it meant, when the room suddenly fell silent. I turned and saw Diddy standing in the doorway. He wasn't dressed in his usual party attire. No flashy suit, no sunglasses. He wore a simple black shirt, the sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal a gold bracelet on his wrist. His face was calm, controlled. His eyes met mine, and for a second, I felt something cold grip my stomach. Then he smiled. "Tonight, chef," he said, stepping forward, "you're cooking something special, something they'll never forget." My throat felt dry. He patted my shoulder, his grip firmer than necessary, and then turned, disappearing back through the door. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after he left. I looked down at the menu again. My hands were shaking. Chapter 2, The Forbidden Menu. The menu arrived in a black leather binder, the cover embossed with gold lettering that simply read, "The Midnight Courses." The weight of it in my hands was heavier than it should have been, like the paper inside was thicker. Or maybe it was something else. Something unseen, something I wasn't ready to acknowledge yet. I ran my fingers along the edges before flipping it open, expecting the usual lineup of decadent, over-the-top dishes fit for the kind of clientele that showed up to parties like this. But the moment my eyes scanned the first page, a slow, creeping unease settled in my chest. This was unlike any menu I'd ever seen. Some of the dishes had no English translation, just symbols that didn't belong to any language I recognized. The ones that did have names were strange. There was a dish called The Offering, another titled Veil of the New Moon. One simply said, Abyss. And then there were the instructions. Odd, unnecessary details written in precise, almost religious wording. The meat must be blessed before plating. All dishes served on black porcelain. White plates are forbidden. Do not allow uninvited hands to touch the final course. My eyes narrowed at the wording. Blessed? Forbidden? I had worked high-profile events where dishes had religious or cultural significance, but this wasn't that. This read like something out of an old manuscript, something ancient, something that had been written long before this party was ever planned. I turned the page, scanning the ingredients list. Some items made sense. Truffle oil, saffron, gold leaf, the kind of luxuries you'd expect at an event of this scale. But then there were things that made my stomach tighten. Sacrificial cut, blood reduction, aged no less than 40 days, nightshade essence, trace amounts only. Some of them I didn't even recognize. I flipped to the next page and froze. One line stood out, written in slightly larger, bolder font than the rest. All midnight courses must be prepared after the clock strikes 12. I was still staring at it when a voice cut through the uneasy silence. You're overthinking it. I turned to see one of the sous chefs standing nearby, leaning against the counter, watching me with a knowing smirk. His sleeves were rolled up, forearms covered in light burn scars. the kind you only got from working the line in a high-stress kitchen for years. I gestured toward the menu. Is this a joke? Who wrote this? His smirk faded slightly. He straightened, glancing over his shoulder before lowering his voice. We don't ask questions here, we just cook. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Right, because none of this is weird to you. He exhaled through his nose, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, man, I've been doing this a long time. There's rich, and then there's this. These people don't live by the same rules we do. They don't eat the same way we do. Just do the job, take the money, and forget about it afterward. His words didn't comfort me. If anything, they made the pit in my stomach grow deeper. Another chef, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, passed behind us, setting a tray of carefully arranged appetizers onto the prep counter. She didn't look up as she muttered, "This isn't a party, it's a ritual." I turned to her. "What do you mean by that?" She didn't answer. She just kept moving, her steps brisk, purposeful, like she was trying not to linger too long near me. The air in the kitchen had changed. I glanced at the other staff, at the way they moved with quiet urgency, at the way no one dared look toward the grand dining hall beyond the doors. The party outside was alive with laughter, music, conversation, but inside the kitchen, it was different. It felt like we were preparing for something else entirely. I focused on the task at hand, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that I was just tired, that the strange atmosphere was nothing more than the pressure of cooking for an event of this scale. But the moment I unwrapped the first cut of meat, my breath hitched. It was too soft, the texture wrong. I'd worked with every kind of protein imaginable. A 5 Wagyu so marbled it melted at room temperature. Fresh game meat still rich with iron. Even exotic cuts most people never had the chance to taste. But this wasn't like any of them. The color was deeper, almost unnaturally rich, and when I pressed my fingers against it, the flesh gave in too easily, like it had already been tenderized from the inside. I moved to the spice rack, pulling out the pre-measured blends that had been prepared ahead of time. Some of them smelled familiar, rosemary, thyme, coriander, but others carried a scent that made my head swim, a sharp, almost medicinal bitterness that clung to my throat. I uncorked the first bottle of wine meant for the reduction sauce. The liquid poured out thicker than it should have been, darker, almost syrupy. It wasn't just a deep red, it was nearly black. I turned to the sous chef from earlier. He was plating something with careful precision, his hands steady, despite the growing unease in the room. "What kind of wine is this?" I asked. He didn't look up. "The expensive kind." I took another glance at the menu. There was a note under the wine reduction, aged for significance, handle with reverence. I let out a slow breath, trying to shake the feeling that had settled deep into my bones. I didn't know what was happening here. I didn't know why everything felt so calculated, so precise, so ceremonial. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about food. I turned back to my station, reaching for my knife, and that's when I saw it. A small folded note, tucked just beneath the edge of my cutting board. The paper was yellowed, aged, like it had been sitting in a drawer for decades. There was no name on it, no indication of who had left it. I hesitated before picking it up, my fingertips brushing the brittle edges. Inside, written in slanted, almost frantic handwriting, was a single sentence. "Don't stay past midnight." A chill crawled up my spine. I turned, scanning the room, searching for who might have left it. But no one was looking at me. No one even acknowledged that I was holding the note. And for the first time since arriving at the mansion, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Thea, Chapter 3, Celebrities, Whispers, and the Unseen Guest. The party had already begun by the time I stepped out of the kitchen. The heavy double doors separating the culinary world from the extravagance of the event opened just enough for me to slip through. and the moment I crossed the threshold, I could feel the difference in the air. Not just the shift in temperature, but something deeper, something more unsettling. The smell of the food we'd been preparing lingered, thick with truffle, seared meats, and exotic spices, but it was overpowered by the scent of incense, something smoky and rich that clung to my skin the moment I inhaled. The grand hall was bathed in gold and black, the theme extending far beyond the decor. Every inch of the space was meticulously curated. The chandeliers cast a low, flickering glow, illuminating rows of banquet tables lined with obsidian plates and golden utensils. The guests moved like shadows, dressed in silk and velvet, their faces calm but unreadable, the way actors look before stepping onto a stage. I recognized some of them immediately. Actors, musicians, fashion moguls, political figures, all the people whose names carried weight. A face from a recent Marvel film, another from an Oscar-winning drama, a chart-topping rapper, a pop star with diamond-encrusted nails tapping lightly against her champagne glass. They were people I had only ever seen through screens, yet here they were, talking in hushed voices, their hands gesturing with the kind of subtle grace that comes from being watched at all times. But the more I looked, the more I realized that not everyone in attendance belonged here. Some of the guests, they weren't celebrities. They weren't models or socialites or the kind of wealthy heirs who usually bought their way into these events. Their faces were too sharp, their eyes too still. They didn't engage in idle conversation, didn't sip their drinks or check their phones. They stood at the edges of the room, watching. Wait. I moved carefully, weaving between tables, taking in the atmosphere. The energy in the room was thick, with something unspoken, tense beneath the surface. Guests murmured to each other in voices too low for me to fully catch, but I caught fragments that made my stomach twist. Tonight is different. And he's taking it further. He actually brought one. I slowed my steps, pretending to inspect one of the elaborate floral arrangements on a nearby table while I listened. The conversation to my left continued in urgent whispers, but the moment I turned my head slightly to look, the two men speaking fell silent, their eyes flickering toward mine for just a second too long before they turned away, resuming their talk in a different language. A waiter brushed past me, moving with the hurried precision of someone who had been working these events for years. His face was tight with something that looked like anxiety, his fingers gripping the tray he carried just a little too hard. I reached out, stopping him with a light touch to his arm. "Hey, quick question," I said, keeping my voice casual. "I saw the guest list earlier. How many people are actually supposed to be here tonight?" Our waiter stiffened immediately. For a second, I thought he wasn't going to answer, but then his eyes darted around the room, scanning for someone, maybe a superior, maybe security, before he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Not all of them came through the front gate," he murmured. I blinked. "What?" His gaze flickered toward a group of guests near the far end of the hall, where the shadows pooled the deepest. They stood in a small cluster, silent, their heads slightly inclined toward one another but not speaking. "They just appeared," the waiter continued. "I don't know when. One second they weren't here, then they were." A chill rolled down my spine. "Who are they?" The waiter shook his head. "I don't know, and I don't want to know." Before I could press him further, a sharp chime rang out through the hall, the sound cutting through the low hum of conversation like a blade. Diddy had risen from his seat at the head of the grand table. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The moment he stood, the room fell silent. Every head turned toward him. In his hand, a crystal goblet filled with something dark. From where I stood, it looked like wine, but in this light it seemed thicker. His smile was slow, deliberate. "My friends," he said, his voice carrying easily, warm but commanding. "Tonight is a celebration. 50 years of life, 50 years of building, of conquering. of setting the stage for something greater. Scattered applause, some nods, but most people just watched him, waiting. Diddy lifted his glass slightly. But tonight is not just about the past. His smile deepened. It's about what comes next. The silence stretched, long enough to make me uncomfortable. Then, all at once, every guest raised their glasses in unison. It was too synchronized, too rehearsed. I felt a prickle of unease crawl down my spine. Diddy spoke again, but this time I didn't understand the words. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I recognized. The syllables rolled off his tongue in low, rhythmic cadence, the sound of it thick, heavy, ancient. And then, as if on cue, the doors to the kitchen swung open. It was time for the first course. A procession of servers emerged, each carrying a single black plate, the dishes meticulously arranged with gold leaf garnishes and glistening sauces. My team had worked tirelessly to prepare these plates, but now, as I watched them being placed before the guests, I felt something sink in my stomach. Because the moment the plates touched the table, everything changed. The room, which had been buzzing with the quiet energy of conversation, went utterly still. No one moved, no one spoke. A man sitting near the center of the table, someone I recognized as a well-known director, lifted his fork with careful precision, spearing a small piece of the dish and placed it in his mouth. I watched as he chewed slowly. Then his eyes fluttered shut. A shudder rippled through his body, subtle but unmistakable. His breath hitched slightly, and then, as if shaking off a moment of dizziness, he exhaled. Around him, the other guests followed, each one taking their first bites in unison. And just like the director, they all reacted the same way. A brief stillness, a flicker of something in their expressions. Pleasure, pain, I couldn't tell. Diddy was watching them carefully, his fingers tapping lightly against the stem of his goblet. Then he turned his gaze toward me, and for the first time that night, he smiled directly at me. I didn't smile back, because I finally understood something. Whatever was happening here, whatever we had just served, it wasn't just food, and I had just become a part of it. Chapter 4. The Hidden Room. I should have gone back to the kitchen. I should have pretended not to notice, not to care. But something about the way that waiter moved, hurried, almost frantic, set off something deep inside me. He wasn't carrying the usual trays of food or drinks. No, he was carrying something else. Something wrapped in a pristine black cloth, held so carefully it was almost reverent. I had seen the staff move quickly all night, but this was different. The way he darted through the shadows, avoiding eye contact, the way his shoulders stiffened whenever someone glanced his way, it was like he knew he wasn't supposed to be seen, and when he disappeared through a side door, one I hadn't noticed before, I made a choice. A stupid, reckless choice. I followed him. The hallway beyond the door was narrow, dimly lit by low, flickering sconces that cast long, shifting shadows across the walls. The further I walked, the quieter the sounds of the main party became, muffled by the weight of whatever space I was stepping into. There were no staff members here, no kitchen clatter, no hurried conversations between sous chefs, just that waiter disappearing through another door at the very end of the corridor. But before he reached it, he did something strange. He paused, took a deep breath, then he pressed his hand against a small gilded emblem embedded into the door frame, a golden eye staring outward. I slowed my steps, keeping my distance, heart pounding against my ribs as I watched the metal beneath his palm glow faintly, just for a second. The door clicked open soundlessly, and he slipped inside. The door was already starting to shut behind him when I caught it. I had just enough time to press myself inside, silent, unseen. And what I stepped into, I knew in an instant that I wasn't supposed to be here. The room was bathed in a deep red glow. Not from lamps or chandeliers, but from something else. Something pulsing beneath the walls, beneath the floor, like the very air was alive. The space was far larger than it should have been, far too expansive for a back room. Ancient symbols were carved into the walls, etched deep into the dark wood and painted over in what looked like gold leaf or something thicker. The patterns weren't decorative. They had meaning, purpose. I could feel it in my bones, in the way my stomach twisted the longer I looked at them. At the center of the room sat a long black marble table, but it wasn't set for dining. There were no plates, no silverware, no centerpieces, just candles, hundreds of them, burning with steady golden flames. And standing around the table were the guests who hadn't come through the front entrance. The ones I had noticed before, lingering at the edges of the party, the ones who had appeared out of nowhere. They were whispering, their voices a soft, rhythmic murmur that almost didn't sound human. It wasn't just a different language, it was something else, something older. Their voices overlapped, weaving together in a way that felt more like chanting than conversation. At the very end of the table, opposite me, Diddy stood with his back turned. I should have left. I should have turned around, walked straight back the way I came, but my eyes drifted toward the table again, toward the thing they were all gathered around. It was covered with a cloth, black velvet, untouched, waiting. And I knew, deep in my gut, in the marrow of my bones, that whatever was underneath it, it wasn't food. The smell hit me all at once. Metallic, sharp, not food, not wine, something else. My stomach clenched. The air was thicker here, heavier, like it carried weight. My head felt light, my pulse too loud in my ears. I had been in countless kitchens, surrounded by the scent of raw meat, of fresh game, of rich, iron-heavy cuts. But this was different. I turned my head slightly, scanning the room. On the far side, just past the candlelit table, I noticed a large, polished bowl sitting atop a stone pedestal. It was filled with the same thick, dark liquid that had been in Diddy's glass earlier. A man in a sleek black suit, his face unreadable, dipped 2 fingers into the liquid. He lifted them to his lips and tasted it, slow, deliberate. Then he passed the bowl to the next guest. One by one, they all did the same. No hesitation, no disgust, just silent acceptance. I took an instinctive step backward. My breath felt too shallow. I needed to leave. And that's when I felt it. Eyes on me. Slowly I turned my head. Across the room, standing in the flickering glow of the candlelight, was a man I hadn't seen before. His suit was the same as the others, black, pristine, tailored, but his face was wrong. It wasn't that he was disfigured or grotesque. No, it was the opposite. He was too perfect. His skin was smooth, his features symmetrical to the point of being unnatural. And his eyes, golden, like molten metal. I didn't hear him move, didn't see him take a step, but suddenly he was closer. Then closer. I blinked, and he was only a few feet away. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. He tilted his head slightly, like he was examining me. Then, in a voice too smooth, too even, he spoke. "You don't belong here." The world tilted beneath me. My vision blurred for a second, my pulse hammering against my skull. When I blinked again, Diddy was looking at me. His gaze was steady, unreadable, but there was no surprise in his face, no anger. Just a slow, knowing smile. I backed away, my hands shaking, my mind screaming at me to move. I turned sharply, heading straight for the door I had come through. My heartbeat was so loud it drowned out the whispers, the murmurs, the flickering candlelight. I pushed through the door, back into the corridor, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't stop moving, didn't slow down until I was back in the kitchen, my hands gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. The kitchen staff barely noticed me. They were still moving, still cooking, still following orders like nothing had changed. But something had changed. I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see, and they had seen me. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking. A quiet sound cut through the noise of the kitchen, a soft rustle of paper. I turned toward my station, where a small folded note had been left atop the cutting board. I hadn't seen anyone place it there. I swallowed hard, my fingers unsteady as I reached for it. There was only one sentence. "You shouldn't have looked." A slow, cold dread settled in my stomach. Because now, I knew. I wasn't leaving this party the same way I came in. Chapter 5. The Warning. The kitchen wasn't the same when I stepped back inside. The heat from the oven still radiated through the air. The smell of roasting meats and simmering reductions still lingered, but the energy, the bustling urgency that had filled this space all night was gone. I hadn't been gone long, 5 minutes, maybe 10, and yet the once crowded kitchen, filled with chefs chopping, stirring, plating, had emptied out completely. The low murmur of kitchen chatter, the sizzle of butter hitting a hot pan, the clinking of knives against cutting boards, all of it had faded into a suffocating silence. I stood there, frozen, gripping the edge of the stainless steel counter. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a cold glow over the abandoned workstations. Pots still sat on burners, simmering, forgotten. A half-sliced duck breast lay on the cutting board, juices pooling around it, as if the person working on it had just stopped. The air felt heavier, thicker. Something was wrong. A prickle of unease crawled up my spine as I turned, scanning the room. There were no sounds from the dining hall, no footsteps of servers moving in and out. No one. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the pantry door. I turned sharply, and that's when I saw him. A man stood there, half shrouded in the dim candlelight bleeding in from the hallway. His suit was black, perfectly tailored, his posture relaxed but precise, as if every inch of his stance was calculated. He wasn't a member of the catering team. I would have remembered him. He stepped forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the tiled floor. The candlelight flickered across his face, and that's when I noticed his eyes. They weren't brown or blue or green like they should have been. They were gold. Not just in color, but in the way they reflected light, unnatural and deep, like molten metal. They caught every flicker of the flames, every shift in the shadows, like they were absorbing it. A sharp cold settled in my gut. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said, his voice calm. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't anger, it was something else, final. I took a slow step back, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I don't know what you're talking about," I lied. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Lying won't help you now." My fingers curled into fists. "If this is some kind of intimidation tactic, you can drop it. I'm just a chef. I came here to cook, nothing else." His golden gaze didn't waver. "That was true, until you stayed past midnight." My breath hitched. The clock in the grand hall. The last time I had seen it, just before I entered the hidden room, the hands had been creeping toward 12, and I had heard it chime. My mouth went dry. I licked my lips, trying to keep my voice steady. "What does that mean?" The man tilted his head slightly, studying me the way a scientist might study an insect pinned to glass. "You signed the contract, didn't you?" I swallowed. I had signed a thick stack of legal documents handed to me before I arrived, but I hadn't read every page. I hadn't thought twice about it. "Most who work here know better than to ask questions," he continued. "But you stepped through a door that wasn't meant for you. You saw something you weren't supposed to see, and now you're part of it." The air in the room suddenly felt too thin. I shook my head. No, I'm not. I didn't. You stayed past midnight, he repeated, his voice almost gentle. I didn't wait to hear what came next. I turned and ran. The kitchen door swung open with a sharp crack as I bolted down the hall, my breath coming fast, my heartbeat erratic. I knew where the service exit was. I had seen it earlier when I first arrived. The back door near the loading dock where crates of imported ingredients had been stacked. If I could just reach it, I could get out, call a car, disappear. But as I ran, the hallway stretched. The walls seemed longer than before, the doors more distant. The lights above me flickered, plunging the corridor into brief moments of darkness before sputtering back to life. My breath hitched. The polished black floor, once smooth and pristine, now seemed to swallow sound. I reached the door, heart hammering, grabbed the handle, twisted. Lock. I yanked harder. The metal didn't budge. I spun around. The man with the golden eyes was still standing at the other end of the hallway, watching me with that same calm amusement. He hadn't moved, but something in the shadows behind him had. I took a step back, pressing against the door. Let me out. You don't understand, he said, stepping forward, slow, deliberate. You never really had a choice. I tried to move again, but my body refused. My muscles locked, my breath stuck in my throat. A sound, low, guttural, echoed through the hallway, like whispers coming from somewhere unseen. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the cold metal of the door handle so tightly my knuckles ached. When I opened them again, the man was gone, and I was back in the kitchen. I hadn't moved. My chest rose and fell in ragged, uneven breaths. My hands trembled at my sides. I turned, half expecting the kitchen to still be empty, but the staff was back. The sous chefs, the servers, the dishwashers, all moving as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just... My station was exactly as I had left it. My knife, my mise en place, my cutting board, and sitting on the counter directly in front of me was a single piece of folded parchment. My breath hitched. I reached for it, my fingers numb, the paper cool against my skin. Inside, written in elegant, slanted handwriting, was a single sentence. You already stayed past midnight? A slow, creeping dread curled around my ribs, tightening. I looked up, scanning the kitchen, searching for... No one was looking at me. No one acknowledged that I was standing there, shaking. They just kept cooking, kept chopping, kept plaiting, like nothing had changed, like everything was normal. But nothing about this was normal. I clutched the note in my fist, feeling the weight of it press into my palm. Because deep down, I knew I wasn't leaving this place the same way I came in. Chapter 6. The Ritual's Climax. My hands were still shaking when I let the note fall onto the counter. The kitchen bustled around me as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just been confronted, as if the world hadn't just shifted under my feet. But something was different. The air felt heavier. The glow of the overhead lights had taken on a strange, muted quality, as if the very walls of this place were closing in. I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady my breath, trying to think, but I couldn't. My mind was a whirlpool of questions I didn't want to answer. I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I had stayed past midnight, and now they were watching me. I could feel it in the way the other chefs moved, mechanical, precise, but avoiding me, like I was no longer one of them. I glanced at the clock, 12:37. I didn't know what was supposed to happen, but I knew, deep in my gut, that it wasn't over yet. Then, as if summoned by the thought, the kitchen doors swung open. A waiter stepped inside, moving with that same eerie smoothness, his tray tucked neatly under one arm. He didn't look rushed, didn't look out of place, but his eyes landed on me immediately. "They're waiting," he said. My mouth felt dry. "Who's waiting?" The waiter didn't answer. He simply set the tray in front of me, On it sat a small black menu card. Unlike the others, this one had no gold trim, no elegant script, just a deep, matte black cover that seemed to absorb the light. I hesitated, then picked it up. The moment my eyes scanned the page, my stomach turned. The writing wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language I recognized. The letters twisted across the page like vines, curling at the edges, flickering as if they were moving when I blinked. But my mind latched on to the only words I could understand. Inner circle. The words sat at the very top, standing out against the impossible script. My chest tightened. "What is this?" I asked, my voice lower now, more unsteady. The waiter smiled. A too perfect smile, stretched just a little too wide. The final dish. Before I could respond, before I could even think about running, I heard the footsteps. Firm, steady, approaching from the hallway. The staff around me stopped moving. I turned just in time to see Diddy step into the kitchen. His expression was calm, relaxed, as if he had been expecting this. His tailored black shirt was still crisp, his sleeves rolled up slightly, his gold bracelet catching the light. His eyes landed on me, and the slow, knowing smile that stretched across his face sent a shiver down my spine. His hand came down on my shoulder, too firm, too deliberate. "It's time for the real masterpiece." I was led back through the same hidden door. The hallway beyond it was different this time, longer. The red glow from before had deepened, thickened, like the very air had become something physical. The same whispers filled the space, low, rhythmic, almost melodic. They weren't coming from the people walking beside me. They were coming from the walls. Diddy didn't speak as we walked, but his presence beside me was suffocating. Every step I took felt like it wasn't my own. We reached the door at the end of the hallway, the same one the waiter had pressed his palm against earlier. This time, it opened on its own. Inside, the chamber was no longer empty. A single, long banquet table stretched across the room, its surface polished black, reflecting the dozens of golden candles burning along the edges. The symbols carved into the walls glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the flickering flames. And seated at the table, they were all there. The same guests from before, the celebrities, the unknown figures, the ones who had appeared out of nowhere. They sat in perfect silence, their gold-rimmed glasses untouched, their eyes fixed forward. At every place setting sat a golden plate, all except one. One spot remained empty. My throat tightened. I barely registered the servers moving past me, placing a single covered dish at the empty space. Diddy's hand was still on my shoulder. He leaned in slightly, his voice barely a whisper. "Go on." I didn't move, couldn't move. The whispers in the walls grew louder. I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to see what was under that lid. I knew if I refused, I wouldn't leave this room. I stepped forward. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle of the silver lid. And Diddy's grip tightened for a split second. Then I lifted it, and my breath caught in my throat, because now I understood. The dish in front of me wasn't extravagant. It wasn't plated with delicate garnishes, wasn't adorned with edible gold or shaved truffle. It was simple, plain. But the cut of meat sitting in the center of the plate, it was still bleeding, still warm. My head spun. The smell of iron and incense coiled around my lungs, thick and suffocating. I stumbled back, my vision swimming. The whispers turned into laughter. Low, rumbling laughter, coming from every person at the table. I turned to Diddy, my pulse hammering against my skull. His smile widened, and then he spoke, his voice slow, deliberate. "You understand now, don't you?" I did. And I wished to God I didn't. Chapter 7. The Escape. Time had stopped. Or maybe it hadn't, and it was just my body that refused to move. I was still standing there, my hands hovering over the plate, my breath caught in my throat, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. The warmth rising from the dish in front of me felt obscene, alive in a way no food should be. I knew what it was now. The laughter had stopped, the murmurs had faded, the room so full of whispers and movement before had turned silent. And I felt them, their eyes, watching, waiting. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look up. The guests at the table were no longer eating. Their plates sat untouched, their glasses of dark, viscous wine left to settle in the candlelight. No one spoke, no one moved. But their faces, calm, expectant, patient, were all turned toward me, as if I were the next course. A weight pressed down on my chest, my stomach twisted, nausea rolling over me in thick waves. I couldn't be here anymore. I couldn't. A slow, deliberate movement at the head of the table caught my eye. Diddy, who was still sitting, his glass held loosely in one hand, his expression unreadable, but his smile had widened. Then, so soft it barely registered, he spoke. "You understand now, don't you?" My throat was too dry to answer. His fingers tapped lightly against his goblet, his head tilted, as if waiting for my reaction, as if he were enjoying this moment. The room pressed in on me. The candlelight flickered, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move on their own. The whispers I had heard before, the ones that came from the walls, the floors, the air itself, were back now, louder, closer. I felt something cold slide down my spine. I had to get out. I stepped back, my foot catching against the edge of the chair. The sharp scrape against the marble floor echoed in the silence. And then I ran. The moment my body moved, the room came alive again. Chairs scraped back, a rush of movement. The guests at the table all turned at once, their heads snapping toward me as I knocked into the nearest waiter, sending a tray crashing to the floor. Someone gasped. A glass shattered. I didn't stop to look. I ran. I tore through the chamber, pushing past figures that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The hallways twisted around me, stretching into impossible distances. The house was different now. The walls felt closer, breathing. The corridors looped into themselves. The sconces flickered in slow, deliberate patterns, like something was watching me through the flames. I sprinted toward where I thought the kitchen was, but it wasn't there anymore. No doors, no exits. My breath hitched. I turned sharply, nearly colliding with a heavy velvet curtain. A shadow passed just behind it. I spun away, heart pounding, pulse roaring in my ears. Another hallway, another turn. I should have reached the grand doors by now, but the house wouldn't let me leave. A sound, low, humming, rhythmic, rose from the walls. A pulse, a beat, like a slow, steady drum. I staggered forward, forcing myself to focus. There, at the far end of the corridor, beyond the distorted chandelier light, I saw it. The grand doors. I ran harder, my breath burning in my lungs, my legs screaming. I didn't care. I didn't look back. I just ran. And just as I reached them, just as I stretched my hand toward the heavy, gilded handles, he was there. The man with the golden eyes. He stood in front of the doors, his suit impeccable, his face as unreadable as before. He didn't move to stop me. Didn't raise a hand. He simply watched. And then, after a moment that stretched impossibly long, he stepped aside. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "You never should have looked." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the door handle, expecting resistance, expecting it to be locked, to be pulled back into the twisting halls. But this time it gave way. The doors burst open, and suddenly, I was outside. The cold night air slammed into my lungs. I staggered forward, my shoes crunching against the gravel driveway. For a moment I just stood there, gasping, trying to force breath into my body. The sky overhead was wrong. The stars seemed muted, distant, like they weren't quite real. The trees that lined the estate stood too still, their leaves unmoving despite the breeze. And then I saw it. A black SUV, idling just beyond the entrance. Wait. My first instinct was to run in the opposite direction. But my legs wouldn't move. The back door of the SUV swung open. I didn't see who was inside, but I felt it. A pull, a command. I didn't question it. I climbed in. The door shut behind me, silent. The driver, a man in a black suit, face hidden by the dim glow of the dashboard, didn't say a word. The engine rumbled softly and the car began to move. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't ask where we were going. I didn't look back at the mansion. But something told me I wouldn't have seen it if I had. For the first time all night, I let myself breathe. My hands were still shaking. My body felt wrong, like I had stepped out of something I wasn't meant to leave. The silence in the car stretched long. The city lights in the distance should have been a comfort, but they weren't. Something had changed, and I didn't know if I would ever be the same again. Chapter 8. The Haunting. I told myself I had left it behind. For a while, I almost believed it. I never cooked professionally again after that night. I packed up my knives, left behind the world I had spent years building, and disappeared. Some part of me wanted to pretend it had never happened, that I had simply walked away from the industry because of burnout, because of exhaustion, because I wanted something quieter. But I knew the truth. I fled. I changed my name, moved to a small town where no one knew me, where no one whispered about private events and exclusive guest lists, where I never had to see another gold-trimmed menu again. I found a job working at a quiet little bakery. No high-pressure kitchens, no extravagant meals, no hidden corridors leading to places I wasn't supposed to see. Just bread, pastries, the occasional coffee order. Simple. Safe. For years it worked. For years, I almost let myself believe that it had just been a party. That I had imagined the things I saw, that the whispers in the walls, the eyes that followed me, the plate I had uncovered in the hidden room, that all of it had been the product of an overworked mind, stretched too thin by long hours and too much stress. But the signs never stopped. The first one came a year after I left. It was just a letter. No return address, no postage, just a small black envelope slipped into my mailbox. I stared at it for a long time before touching it, something heavy settling in my chest. My fingers shook as I lifted the flap. Inside was a single card, golden lettering embossed against the matte black surface. No message, no sender, just my name. I burned it that night. But it didn't matter, because they kept coming. Every few months, a new one. Always unsigned, always untouched by the elements, no matter how bad the weather was. It didn't stop at the invitations. I started feeling it. The weight of unseen eyes. I'd be walking home from work, the streets quiet, the air still, and suddenly I'd feel a presence just behind me. Never close enough to see, never loud enough to confirm. But I knew. Some nights I'd catch movement from the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the edge of my vision, dressed in black, unmoving, but the moment I turned, they'd be gone. And then there were the times I saw him. Diddy. I never met him again, never received a direct message or a call, but I'd see him on TV, at award shows, at exclusive parties, at interviews where he smiled like nothing had ever happened. Like that night had just been another event, another indulgence in a long history of excess. But every time he was on screen, I felt it. That moment. That second where he would glance toward the camera, not for the audience, not for the fans, but for me. A flicker of acknowledgement, as if he knew I was watching, as if he was still watching me. I stopped watching TV after that. I started locking my doors 3 times before bed. I kept a knife beside my nightstand, even though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. I convinced myself that as long as I kept my head down, as long as I never spoke about that night, as long as I ignored the letters, I would be left alone. And for a while it almost seemed true, until the night I came home and found it waiting for me. It was late. I had worked a double shift, exhausted from kneading dough and frosting cakes, from pretending I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder. I unlocked my apartment door, stepped inside, and the moment I set my keys down, I knew the air was wrong. The scent of my apartment, clean linen, faint traces of coffee from the morning, was gone. In its place was something else, something richer, something iron-heavy, the same scent I had smelled that night. I turned toward the dining table and froze. A single dish sat at the center of the table, placed carefully, deliberately, atop a black porcelain plate. My breath stopped. I didn't move. I didn't need to lift the lid to know what was underneath. My fingers curled into fists. I wasn't imagining it. I had never left. My pulse hammered against my skull. I forced my legs forward step by step, closing the distance between me and the table. The silver lid gleamed in the dim light. My hands shook as I reached out, as my fingers brushed against the cool metal. I lifted it, and my stomach turned. The same dish, perfectly plated, still warm, still bleeding. I staggered back, knocking over a chair, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. And then I saw it, tucked just beneath the plate, folded with careful precision. A note. My hands trembled as I reached for it. The paper felt too smooth, too crisp, like it had been placed there seconds before I walked in. I unfolded it. Only one sentence. "You never really left." The words blurred in my vision. My fingers tightened around the note, my knuckles turning white. I felt something shift in the room. The temperature dropped. The shadows along the walls grew longer. A familiar whisper curled against my ear. Too close, too real. I turned sharply, expecting to see someone standing there, expecting to see those golden eyes watching from the darkness. But I was alone, except I wasn't, because I would never be alone again. I let the note fall from my fingers, my breath coming in uneven gasps. And in the silence that followed, I realized something. This had never been about leaving. I had been allowed to run, allowed to change my name, allowed to disappear. But I had never escaped, and I never would.